Thank you, Mr. President. And let me start by welcoming Minister Katz, Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs, for his presence here today. SRSG Patton, I want to thank you. I want to thank your team for producing this factual, methodical, and sobering report, a report that confirms what we have known for months. On October 7th, Hamas, a terrorist organization, carried out horrific acts of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and gang rape. We knew this because victims, survivors, and first responders bravely came forward to share their stories and their evidence. We knew this because we saw the gruesome footage of Hamas's attack, footage that Hamas proudly filmed and shared online. And yet, so many people around the world, including some members of this council, have been silent in the face of these atrocities. Worse, some openly viewed these atrocities with suspicion and skepticism. And it's unforgivable, and it is a gross affront to all survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. Colleagues, I want to read a line from the UN's report. Quote, "The mission team found that several fully naked or partially naked bodies from the waist down were recovered, mostly women, with hands tied and shot multiple times, often in the head," unquote. There can be no doubt about what happened on October 7th. The evidence before us is damning and devastating. Now the only question is, how will we respond? Will this council finally condemn Hamas's sexual violence, or will we continue to stay silent? And I urge all council members to continually, unequivocally condemn Hamas's terrorist acts, as most of you have done today. As I've said many times before, this should not be difficult. This is the bare minimum. Colleagues, I also want to speak about the report's findings in the West Bank. The report notes, and I quote again, stakeholders indicated that the detention of Palestinian men and women has been compounded by alleged instances of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, including increased instances of various forms of sexual violence, unquote. Let me be clear. All parties to this conflict must uphold their obligations under international law with regard to the treatment of detained individuals. But as a democracy, we expect Israel to hold all of those who have committed these acts accountable for such acts. We also urge and expect members of this council to avoid drawing a false equivalency between these actions and hostage-taking by a foreign terrorist organization. But let me be clear, these two things are not the same. I also want to note the report's recommendation for Israel to sign a framework of cooperation with the Office of the SRSG SVC. This framework and independent investigations will help secure justice for victims and survivors of the October 7th attack, and for families whose loved ones are still being held by Hamas. Tragically, we know that Hamas's deranged acts of sexual violence are ongoing. The UN report found, and I quote again, clear and convincing information that some hostages have been subjected to various forms of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape and sexualized torture and sexualized, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, unquote. And, quote, reasonable grounds to believe that such violence may be ongoing, unquote. Each day hostages are detained by Hamas is another day they could be subjected to sexual violence and other horrors. Every single member state must call on Hamas to release every single hostage, But we also have to remember and remind Hamas that they continue to hold the remains of not just some of those who were taken on October 7th, but remains such as Hadar Golden, whose mother is here with us today, and his remains have to be returned to his grieving mother. And this council must call on Hamas to agree to the ceasefire deal on the table. Israel has already agreed to the terms of this deal. The fighting could and should stop today if Hamas would just release the first hostage and stop using people as pawns. If Hamas actually cared about the Palestinian people, it would agree to this deal, which would enable much more humanitarian relief to get into the hands of Palestinian civilians in Gaza who are starving, who don't have clean water or adequate shelter or essential medicines, many who live in abject fear that they or family members will not survive the night. As you all know, the United States has put forward a resolution that supports the negotiations happening on the ground and would help pave the way toward a sustainable cessation of hostilities and a lasting peace that will facilitate Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security. It also does what the Council has failed to do. It condemns Hamas. We will continue to work with all Council members to forge consensus around this resolution. Colleagues, next month, the SRSG will release her annual report, and we expect that it will show a substantial increase in conflict-related sexual violence around the world. In Sudan, in DRC, Nigeria, Ukraine, Haiti, the list goes on and on. Our charge has never been more clear. We must work together to bring perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence to justice. We must work together to support survivors, all survivors, and we must work together to stamp out conflict-related sexual violence once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President.